Welcome back. We need to say from the outset that the field of the philosophy of Jewish education is a much more limited one than the general field of the philosophy of education. The number of scholars, books and articles comprise a fairly modest library. This literature is nevertheless quite varied and adopts a number of what John Levison calls modes. We will find some of these modes reflected in the syllabus of our course. So this discussion helps make sense of the rationale for our selection of issues and topics. Levison identifies 5 distinct modes in which work in the philosophy of Jewish education is conducted, and we will look at each of these in turn. The first mode is the excavation of ideas from the Jewish tradition. In this mode, we look at the central classical texts of the tradition, which in themselves are not philosophical texts, and ask, what do they say, imply, or assume about education that can then be formulated in philosophical terms? Excavation makes us think of the archaeologist who digs into the ground to extract knowledge about the past. In this excavation, we may also discover ideas and practices that have been obscured or lost over time. In our course, we will look at the Bible and rabbinic literature in this way. What did education mean in biblical times? What form did the education of the young take? Talmudic literature deals more explicitly with education, and discussions and descriptions of educational practice are quite common in this literature. Neither the Bible nor the Talmud is a philosophical text. The philosopher, however, can spell out in conceptual terms what is expressed in a more concrete, non-philosophical language in these texts. This first mode is essentially descriptive, an attempt to give a valid account of these implicit ideas without necessarily seeking to apply them or advocate for them. The second mode looks at explicitly philosophical texts from the tradition. For example, our course will devote attention to the educational thinking of Maimonides. Here, unlike in the basic texts of the tradition, like the Bible and the Talmud, the texts themselves are philosophical in character. We need to understand the ideas against the context of the philosophizing of the time. Even when these philosophical texts do not explicitly address education, close examination may uncover educational assumptions and implications. This mode, too, is essentially descriptive in trying to discover what Maimonides actually thought. Whether the ideas are relevant for our current thinking and practice is a secondary question in this mode. The third mode, Levison calls a normative dialogue with the tradition. In this mode, the thinker has a commitment to the value of the tradition and its texts, but they also have a commitment to other values and ideas. These values may appear to be in tension or even conflict with the tradition. For example, the thinker may be committed to values of democracy, individual autonomy, or gender equality. These do not obviously stem from the tradition itself. The philosopher of Jewish education then conducts a dialogue between these sources of value and the sources of the tradition in an effort to construct a coherent outlook as a basis for education. This dialogue may involve what has been called translation, that is, rendering traditional concepts in modern philosophical terms that make the traditional concepts potentially relevant for modern people. A leading exponent of this kind of philosophy of education was one of my own teachers, the late Michael Rosnack. This kind of philosophizing is normative and not simply descriptive, as it tries to lay out a path which Jewish education should pursue in the present. We will attend to this mode of thinking when, for example, we examine the question of the tension between authority and autonomy, or the possibility of pluralism in Jewish education. The fourth mode engages with clarifying the purposes or aims of Jewish education. In the past, Jewish education was practiced in the context of a traditional Jewish community. Its purpose and its content were generally accepted. Modernity has shattered this consensus. Jews responded to the crisis of modernity in diverse ways, and with these responses came diverse forms of education. Clarity about aims and hoped for outcomes may assist the achievement of these aims. One way our course will draw on this mode will be when we look at the emergence of a new kind of Jewish identity around the beginning of the 20th century that defined Jewishness as a secular national identity. What should be the aims and content of Jewish education under such a definition? Similarly, modern Jewish thinkers such as Franz Rosenzweig and Emanuel Levinas faced the erosion of Jewish identity and education in the context of open societies in the diaspora, in which Jews had the opportunity to participate in the general culture in which they lived. Can Jewish education be more than just another form of religious education? Is its function merely to prepare the young by conveying basic teachings and the skills needed to perform in limited religious contexts, such as in the synagogue and other ritual activity? The final mode identified by Leveson involves a reflection on educational practice. One example of this in our course is the discussion of pluralism and Jewish education. The issue arises acutely in the practice of community-based schools, where children from different Jewish religious backgrounds come together. In Israel, there are some schools that have broken with the pattern of dividing children into general state schools and religious state schools. In these schools, Orthodox, traditional and secular children study in the same school. How should Jewish education be conducted in these settings, which respects the values and way of life of the various students, but which is nevertheless coherent and not a jumble of conflicting standpoints? Let us take a moment to reflect on what we have done in this first class. First, we gained an understanding of the general field of the philosophy of education. We saw how the philosophy of education has a long history and is carried on in quite diverse ways. We then moved to the specific field of the philosophy of Jewish education, and we looked at the various modes in which work in the philosophy of Jewish education is done and how these modes are reflected in the content of our course. Our next class will take us back to the Bible. We will attempt to excavate from this core text, which, as we have said, is itself not written in a philosophical mode, educational ideas, values and practices which can contribute to a philosophical discussion of Jewish education.